Well, as you all know very well, I am not exactly a fan of the banks closing down people's accounts, making life miserable for small business, crushing out cash and closing down 3/5 of their branches in the last 8 years. But there's another story, and it's an old story, but actually it's an even bigger scandal. It is the PPI mis-selling story. Yes, you've heard of it before, but I wonder whether you really understood what the implications of it were, and indeed are, because it's not gone away. Well, I'm joined by Damon Parker, senior partner of law firm Harcus Parker, and you are the law firm leading a new legal case. From the top, Damon, and thank you for joining us here in the studio. What was PPI?
PPI was theoretically a kind of insurance that would protect you from not being able to repay your loans. But the problem with it was, first of all, it was bad insurance. It frequently didn't cover what it was supposed to cover. If you were self-employed, for example, it didn't cover you, obviously, and often people were covered for that risk anyway. But the big issue, the one that hasn't, I think, been adequately publicised, is the fact that for every pound you paid in PPI premium, between 75% and 90%, 95% sometimes, was a commission paid to the bank.
So an absolute mega rip-off.
Astonishing.
And this was never declared.
It was never declared. It's a secret commission. And so,
secret commission?
And so...
But that must be illegal, surely.
It's been found by the Supreme Court in PPI cases to be against the provisions of the Consumer Credit Act. It's unfair.
So how were the banks selling this? How were that? I mean, millions signed up for this. Because the idea that you pay a small amount of money, and then if you lose your job or you fall ill, there'll be enough money there to cover your mortgage. And I mean, you know, I can see the appeal of it. How were they selling it? On the phone, or how was it sold?
Well, it depends very much on the kind of loan that you had. If you were taking out a mortgage or an unsecured loan, you might be sold it. But often, if you had a credit card, you just had it. You were given it, so it wasn't sold to you as such. It was just there
just tacked on.
It was just there in the small print, and so frequently people don't know. And this is the essence of these secret commission claims. You don't know that you paid a secret commission, but often you don't even know that you had PPI. It might have been in the statement, but you had to be looking carefully to see it. And so that's the scandal. It's a greater part of this.
What was the timeline on this, Damon?
Well, PPI started to be sold in probably the 80s. 64 million policies were sold overall. And although we think probably about £50 billion has been returned to customers, including the expenses of the banks, 18 billion, the FT says, it still is in the banking system to be returned to customers.
So when did it stop operating?
Well, it hasn't necessarily stopped.
Still there in a way.
It's there now. I've seen offer letters settling apparently PPI claims where it's sort of said in the small print, and by the way, we assume because you need it, you want PPI to continue. You've got to be looking carefully to spot it and say no.
I'm just thinking, Mr. and Mrs. Smith are sitting right now in Kettering on their sofa watching this. They don't know whether they had PPI, do they?
Probably not, but if they had a credit card, they probably did.
Right.
And they can check. We can check for them.
Yes.
And if I can plug this, ppiglo.com, sign up, we'll check for you. And 350,000 people or so have already asked us to check.
Yeah.
And we have 50,000 clients ready to go on these cases.
And what could Mr. and Mrs. Smith be entitled to?
It depends very much on how they use their credit card, what kind of PPI it was. But if you do an averaging out of £18 billion and 6 million people, we think about £3,000 per person. But it depends very much on when it was as well, because interest pays a significant...
It's big money. So in general, I'm taking out a mortgage and I take out this insurance cover, and typically what would it cost me? Say I'm taking out a £100,000 mortgage. Typically, what would the PPI cover have cost me?
It might just be a few pounds a month, or a few tens of pounds a month. And if it's credit cards, it's less. But don't forget that it's useless insurance. You should never have it. And anyway, you could have got it for less money somewhere else, presumably, because someone else wouldn't be charging you 90% commission.
And these legal battles have gone on for years and years. You mentioned already that this went as far as the Supreme Court. And yet, we don't hear much about this anymore, do we?
No, we don't, because one of the stories is that PPI stopped. It didn't stop, but it was supposed to stop in 2019. Remember those Arnold Schwarzenegger adverts? There was a kind of Arnold Schwarzenegger robot, and that was to encourage people to come forward to claim through the FCA scheme. But that was a peculiar scheme, because it didn't really give people back everything that they'd lost or been charged. The FCA proposed that there was a tipping point between fairness and unfairness. The tipping point was 50%. So if you paid 80% commission, you got 30% back.
And this was banks, building societies,
credit card companies, store card operators, anyone who's giving people loans, consumer loans, was pretty well charging PPI. Because it was such a bean feast. It was good for the people who sold it, it was good for the banks, and they made a lot of money. And even now, it's been terribly profitable for them.
I just find this whole, the sheer amounts of money, but just repeat, how much money has been returned to individuals?
We think about £50 billion.
£50 billion has gone back to British consumers who were ripped off with a hidden commission on PPI. That is a vast amount of money.
It's a huge amount of money. But despite that, I want to stress, it's still been a very, very profitable product for the banks because they've still got 18 billion of it. And they know who their customers were. They could write to everyone and say that you have PPI, do you want to claim it back?
But they're not going to do it without a massive action. Yeah. So how do you operate in this? So people get in touch with the PPI site that you've set up. You run a quick check. You tell them yes or no. And how do you operate? Is this a big class action that you take legally?
Yeah, it's a group action. So we're going to try to run the cases all together. It hasn't been done before in this type of
very American style of doing things.
But it has to be more efficient, more coherent, more cost effective. Because at the moment, a small number, or I say a small number, tens of thousands of cases are in the county courts being pursued individually. They're difficult to run. They're expensive to run, and the banks can crush them.
Yeah. So strength in numbers.
Strength in numbers.
Now, I have to get a response from the industry to everything that's just been said, because a spokesman for UK Finance, the body that represents the banks and building societies, has said the FCA's deadline for customers to make a complaint to a firm which sold them PPI was in August 2019. Firms will review and respond to any claims made in legal proceedings as required. Now, I've got to tell you, Damon, I'm not a big fan of the FCA, but they're saying, no, it's all too late.
But it's not too late, because what the FCA couldn't do was extinguish your legal rights. It was the end of their scheme, and they had set up a scheme that made it easy for people to claim without resorting to litigation. Now it's necessary for people to go to the courts. And we say this is the only effective way of vindicating your rights.
Damon Parker, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Fascinating. Very, very interesting indeed. Well, we're all back from Manchester. Luckily, those of us who didn't have to come back by train have managed to make it back from... I got back in the early hours of this morning. Jacob, I was just saying, on the positives about Manchester, an astonishing number of young people.
Oh, amazing. I addressed a Young Conservatives drinks reception yesterday evening, and it was